So happy to bring in from TSN 1050 and TSN, the host of Overdrive. It is Bryan Hayes. Hayes, if you had a chance to be going somewhere on AllStar Weekend, where would it be?
Not the game, for sure. I mean, I would have no interest in actually going to the game. If I was like a seasoned vet like Matthews, I heard you guys talking about Auston, and I think Jay might be onto something. I mean, if you're out for a minimum 3 weeks, I think you have to be rehabbing. The Leafs are so conscious of that. I think Matthews is so conscious of like his reputation, about how focused they are on the playoffs. He gets caught in Vegas or Miami or something, and he's actually got a legitimate injury, and there's no reason to believe that he doesn't. I'm not sure that's a good sign, and I think he's probably thought of that, and I think the Leafs have thought of that. But for me, it's probably Vegas. You can't go wrong in Vegas. Maybe with the bye week afterwards, although the Leafs would be playing in Columbus, if you could sneak in an Arizona trip, Super Bowl vibes, waste management vibes, something along those lines for sure.
Hayes, Rosie just went to Vegas. He has a good story that I'll tell you off air that we can't tell on this show just yet, but it's pretty fantastic. So it's the Leafs and Bruins tonight. What's your general scope on this matchup? Obviously, this rivalry and the Leaf season thus far, Bryan.
Well, I mean, they've had a great season. You can't control what other teams are going to do. The Bruins, you just got to tip your cap. They've lost 3 in a row, but look at the competition they've lost to. It's Tampa, Carolina, and Florida in overtime. Those are 3 really good teams, Tampa and Carolina in particular. So I think from that standpoint, you're going to get a great outing from the Bruins. They seem really inspired to prove it every single night. I think they're looking at history. They're looking at the standings. You get this deep into the season, you can start actually thinking about, chasing 62 wins, 63 wins, and maybe doing something no team has ever done before. So I think the Bruins show up. I think they have a great game tonight. But I expect the Leafs to play well. Like what you mentioned prior to having me on is absolutely true. You look at post-break, home and home against Columbus, they probably lose one of them somehow. Columbus, the worst team, but they'll find a way, right? They got a home and home, I believe, with Chicago. They'll find a way to lose one of those. They got the Habs in there. They always struggle against them. But the Bruins, I think they'll play well. I think they'll play strong. And you have to have some sort of internal inspiration to circle a game or two down the stretch that means a little bit more. And this Boston matchup, any games against Tampa, I think that's basically what we're talking about. We know it's coming. The Leafs are going to play Tampa in the first round, and if they get through, they're likely going to play Boston. And they've got a great history against Boston in terms of memories, in terms of meeting them in the playoffs. We know how the results have actually played out. The Bruins have owned them in the playoffs, but I think it'll be a fun game. I think it'll be a great game. I think both teams going into the All-Star break and a bye, there's no reason not to leave everything on the line. So it should be a fun game tonight.
Hazy, do you think Rosie, they have any chance of catching Boston? You think there's any chance of that happening, or would it have to be like an epic collapse kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's more on Boston, right? You can't expect the Leafs to be any better than they have consistently been, right? It's the chance of the Leafs aren't going to play 900 hockey in their final 30 games. That's just not realistic. So even if the Leafs stay exactly where they are, that might be asking too much, considering the games tighten up a little bit down the stretch. If you clinch early, maybe you take your foot off the gas. So from a Leaf perspective, I would just expect that they kind of stay where they're at. So it would have to be Boston. Clearly, you have to win tonight in regulation, right? They got Boston, I think, end of the season in Boston. Maybe that game means something. Maybe you got to win that in regulation. But I don't know. I think even if the Bruins lose tonight, that's 4 in a row. They're still miles ahead, and they're such a good team. I don't see it happening. I mean, it would be an epic collapse by the Bruins, and everything they've shown us through 50-plus games would suggest that that's likely not going to happen.
Yeah. Guys, I'm so jaded, and I've been covering this team just like you, Bryan, for a long time. I don't care who they play in the first round. I've seen them lose to Columbus, Montreal, Boston. List your opponents. So if we want to get into a match where we're trying to pinpoint an opponent for the Leafs, I just think it's the wrong scenario. But you talk about Boston. Obviously, they've been a juggernaut this season, Hayes. Bo Horvat, they lose out on him. I mean, there's no secret. The Bees were in on Horvat. So if you're Toronto, if you're Kyle Dubas, are you reactionary to what Boston and Tampa are doing, or do you sort of stay in your lane here?
No, I don't think so, because I mean, even if the Leafs do nothing, they're still going to have the exact same expectation, right? You have to win. Like it doesn't matter what they do between now and the 3rd. And that's not to suggest they won't do anything. I'd be shocked if they didn't. I can't get a read on if they're going big game hunting or if they just want to, plug in a 3rd line guy and a depth defenseman. I think we're obviously going to find that out between now and March 3rd, but it's difficult to get a read on where the Leafs stand right now. But I think you have to expect all 3 teams to be active in some capacity. Tampa is every single year. It's like they don't have the same cap that everyone works with, right? They got all those great players, and they're constantly acquiring pieces. They're always all in. They're always willing to trade prospects and picks, and that's not going to change between now and March 3rd. And the Bruins are in a similar situation where they know what they're dealing with in terms of how good they've been this year. They're going to have home ice throughout the playoffs, and the likelihood that Bergeron, Krejci are leaving at the end of the season. Pasternak's going to get a massive contract that's going to affect their cap. So I think from a Bruins perspective, like they're really narrow-minded. They are thinking simply the next 4 or 5 months. So I expect them to do something big. In other words, I think the Leafs know that. I think Tampa knows it. Boston knows it. You expect things are going to happen. You have to try to plug holes where you believe they are and where you think you can fill them. But regardless of where we stand on March 4th, from a Leaf perspective, nothing is going to, the Bruins could go out there and get Patrick Kane, Ryan O'Reilly. Tampa could pick up Timo Meier and Jake McCabe, and it doesn't matter. No one in Toronto is going to be like, oh, well, now, if you lose, it's all good. It's still going to be the exact same expectation on March 4th. And I think the Leafs are aware of that. So I think you stay in your lane, you do what you're going to do, and you let the chips fall where they're going to fall.
Armchair GM, though, who have you pinpointed players? I know Barbashev's names come up. We had Elliot Friedman on the show last week. We've had Dave Pagnotta and obviously other insiders like Frank Cervelli, works for Daily Faceoff here. Is there a guy that you have in mind that makes a lot of sense for the Maple Leafs?
No, I don't think there is a specific player. We had Keith Jones on our show last week, and Jonesy brought up the Tampa example when they first went on that cup run, and that was when they picked up Blake Coleman from Jersey, and Barclay Goodrow. I think he was in San Jose at the time, and they had to pay a premium for those 2 guys, but they were not coming in to push Kucherov out of the way, right, or Matthews out of the way, or even be in the same conversation. It was like, we're going to bring in a 3rd line, we're creating a 3rd line, and they connected with Yanni Gordon. The rest was history. So those type of players, like Barbashev, would probably fit that. That's not where Patrick Kane necessarily fits, right? In terms of his reputation, Timo Meier is not a guy. He could play on the 3rd line. Obviously, any of these guys could, but we're so focused on the big names because, it's a sexier conversation. And there's a part of me that, from a content creation standpoint, I'm sure I can speak for you guys, I think that would be awesome. If you found a way to bring in Kane or Meier or whatever, it'd be amazing just to be able to see him in a Leaf uniform, see how they impact the game. But I think it's more likely that they try to chip away on a 3rd line. They chip away on depth, and they chip away on some sort of depth on the defensive end. So I'm not waiting for some massive splash. And I'm not sure if the Leafs are bracing for that either. Because, listen, the way this team is built is it's Matthews, Marner, Nylander, Tavares. That up front, you're not surpassing that. You're not bringing in someone who you think is going to have more pressure to perform than those 4 guys. So once you're below that, you are talking depth, regardless of who they are and what their talents are. So I think it's more plug and play kind of guys that may not necessarily be, A1 sports page type names. But I think Dubas and company understand if they get a couple of them, they can really supply a lot of depth and possibly impact come playoff time.
Rosie?
Yeah, I think people get too hung up on making the big splash, and they don't realize how hard it is to do that. I mean, you're up against cap, you got contract issues, there's so many moving parts. You could desperately want to add this piece, and it's just not going to happen. And people are just like, well, should they do this or should they do that? It's it's not that easy, and people lose sight of that, especially during trade deadline. I've noticed. I just can't imagine how hard it is to put in a deal and how many moving parts there are. But speaking of trade deadline, I was curious. I think you guys do such a wicked job on Overdrive, and being new to the media, we follow one team, and I kind of scramble to sometimes stay up to date on it. I was curious. Obviously, TSN app and all that's got great information, but what do you guys use to stay up to date with all these things? What's your strategy to stay on the inside and be on top of things the way you guys are?
Well, this is where publicly everyone carves Twitter. right? Everyone's like, oh, it's a cesspool. It's the worst. It's awful. I never want to be on it. And then we're on it 23 hours a day because it is the best collection of material. Like, quite frankly, I was having breakfast this morning. We got a new rule too. I got 2 young kids. We're trying to keep iPads off the table, phones off the table. I'm more guilty than my 3-year-old and my 7-year-old. And I literally open Twitter and Tom Brady's video pops up. And like, that's going to get out anyway. By the time you get to 4:00, no one's O's not walking in saying, oh, I didn't know Tom Brady retired. Like, everyone's going to know that. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
But Twitter has changed everything in terms of just focusing content, where like when I got into the industry, years ago, it was like, you read the papers, you found different websites, you'd find blogs, and you just try to like amalgamate everything into a sheet or two where you can focus on it and possibly come up with some discussion points. Now, Twitter supplies you with so much information, so many different stories that you just couldn't find on tsn.ca or whatever it is, just because of the nature of it and how quick it is. So really, a lot of it is social media driven. It's completely changed the industry. And
sense.
it's yeah. And listen, there are pros and cons to it, of course, but like, look at what's going on with the Leafs. The Leafs are probably on the ice right now, and there's probably 15 reporters down there sending out lines, sending out when I got into the industry, that wasn't a part. Like, Twitter wasn't around. It was, you had to wait until puck drop to find out if there was a line change. If someone was on the third line, you didn't know until the first shift, and you're like, oh, that's different. Now hours in advance, and you can kind of focus a conversation around that. So social media, it's changed everything.
Yeah, it's also a cesspool. I thought for a hot minute that Margot Robbie and Mitch White were a thing, right?
You fell for that? That is so outrageous. Like, that is ridiculous that you fell for that. That's the whole point, is that Mitch White's not pulling in Margot Robbie. First of all, she's married. Secondly, Mitch White, are you nuts? Like, there's no way he was pulling in Margot Robbie. That was, and I saw that too. It was everywhere. People were quote tweeting it. Get this guy a 2-year contract. Yeah, he's going to win the Cy Young next year. And you're right. That is an element of the cesspool, because I've been on the wrong side of it a bunch, where I've gone with something and I've learned my lesson, and then I realize that's a dummy account, or like, especially around the trade deadline, the amount of fake accounts pop up, and then you want them to exist, right? Like, it's coming. It's coming. On March 3rd, there's going to be someone, a dummy account, Patrick Kane's a Leaf, and everyone will be like, well, that's kind of
Meyer
cool.
too.
Then you realize, he's got 4 followers and it's completely bogus. So yeah, you got to be careful on that front.
And now Elon just fucked Twitter for life. Just one more before we let you go. I can't wait for 4 Eastern time and your take on Tom Brady. People are going nuts for this fucking video. I don't know why, man. I don't even watch football, and I can tell you the guy's playing a game next year. Maybe you have a different feel, but speaking of acts, I got a lot of heat over the last 24 hours for my comments on Matt Murray. We were actually in the alumni box. No penne pesto, by the way, on Friday. But we were in the alumni box, and I was heated over the fact that I wheel out there, couple pops in me, and it's your boy Ilya Samsonov. Matt Murray's the ball cap on the bench. But what's your read on that situation with Matt Murray?
Well, I think it's consistent with what has been, his situation for 3 years now. In Ottawa, they had to move on. They had enough. They couldn't trust that he would play. There were a lot of reports coming out of Ottawa, about his health, about his ability to just stay in the net. And that's a part of being a pro athlete. It's I think maybe the most difficult part of it. Rosie, you can speak to it better than Nick and I can. But the expectation that you got to battle through injuries. You've got the best ability is availability. And the truth is with Matt Murray is that it's very unpredictable. I don't believe it's a coincidence that both times this has happened, it's been against his former team, right? Like, it was the 3rd game of the season, I think it was.
That's the game.
He was playing Ottawa. He was going in there, and that was a game day like skate. This was in the warm up, but it jams up Samsonov for sure. You could tell Keefe wasn't ecstatic about it afterwards. Keefe and the Leafs, you have to cover for the guy. They should cover for him. Like, of course, they're not going to show their hand, but it does feel similar to what the Leafs went through with Freddie Anderson a few years ago, where it was from that standpoint, like, the Leafs were almost as blunt as they could get publicly, or as they're willing to get, when they were basically saying, we don't know. The guy's been cleared. We figured he'd be playing, but he's not playing. And I don't know if that's going to be the case down the stretch with Murray, but what softens it is that Samsonov's been so good. He's been so good.
Yeah.
He's been healthy outside of early in the season when he was banged up, and he's rolling. And we're deep enough into the season where I think you should have belief, and I have belief it will likely continue. So the Murray story it's predictable. He's injuries. He's got injuries. He doesn't really play through injuries. And I'm not sure how available he will be down the stretch. We'll find out on February 10th after this break. But I don't think it matters as much because Samsonov's available and he's healthy and he's young and he's playing so well. So I think from a Leaf perspective, Samsonov's going to be the guy.
Yeah, don't forget, he's a Sioux Greyhound. They want him in there for game 1 of the Stanley Cup play. And we joked about this last week. Maybe you have some splits where you start Murray on the road and Samsonov on home ice. I heard you talking about that yesterday, but we'll leave it at that. Hayes, it's been a blast. Keep entertaining the masses, man. I told you off air, your show is phenomenal, and keep addressing that nation, okay?
Yes, I will continue to address the nation. Oh, that's usually O's role, but I'll find a role in that in some capacity. And I appreciate you guys having me on. It's been a blast, and anytime for you guys. Thank you for doing this.